Giedo is from University of Amsterdam, from ISHSE, project lead in the BARCOVID. Giedo, I would say welcome to the floor, explain, and you have got a bit of a feeling already of your audience, of Helga, for instance, so it's interesting. Please start your presentation and good luck.
Good. I hope that everyone can see my screen and hear me. And,
yep.
So thanks. Welcome, everyone. Thanks, Pauline, for the introduction. As said, my name is Giedo Jansen from the University of Amsterdam. At the University of Amsterdam, I'm Assistant Professor Regulation of Labor. And in that capacity, I don't only have the privilege of being the project leader of the BARCOVID project, but also here to share with you the first results of our BARCOVID project. Well, as introduced by Pauline already, the BARCOVID project in its aim seeks to understand how the COVID pandemic has affected collective negotiations, collective bargaining and the outcomes thereof, but also the wider industrial relations climate. And this BARCOVID project is a multi-method a project taking that question from different perspectives. And one of them, now I'd like to skip to the next slide. Yeah. One of them is this survey project which we conducted, and that's what I will be talking about first. So to kick this off a bit, this is the first presentation in a series of 3, and this is to break down also the logic of that sequence of presentations a bit. So the BARCOVID project seeks to understand how COVID has affected both the negotiation process, so how the negotiation process, the renewal of collective agreements has been affected by the pandemic. That's one. That's what this presentation will be about. And these subsequent presentations will also put that in a bit more wider perspective, looking at how the COVID pandemic has affected the industrial relations climate. That's the type of methodological approach which Pauline also referred to as. There we collected and analyzed a wide array of text messages, press releases, newsletters and such to gauge the effect of the COVID pandemic in a bit more wider context. And of course, lastly, this project looks at whether or not the outcomes of collective agreements have been affected by the pandemic. And that is where we look really to collective agreements as such, the content of collective agreements, and make a before and after comparison really of the specific clauses which may or may not have changed under the pressure of the COVID pandemic. This is just to break down the logic of the different components of the BARCOVID project, and unsurprisingly, maybe this is also the order in which we'll be going through the results today in a 3-series presentation. So what I will be talking about here is basically the question, how has the COVID pandemic influenced the negotiation process, renewing collective agreements in various European countries? We did so, or we tried to do so, fielding an international survey among negotiators for which we reasonably suspected that they were involved in collective negotiations for agreements which were taking place during the pandemic. And to this end, we started from the collective agreement database, which Armanda Cetrullo will talk about later in a bit more detail, in which we identified for several countries multiple agreements that we wanted to analyze. For all those agreements, we identified the negotiating parties, organizations, trade unions, employee organizations, businesses, employer organizations, and where possible, we try to find individual negotiators as well. So really finding the names and also the contact information of individual people as much as we could for these collective agreements. We ended up with a list of about 1,300 organizations and people which we identified as potential negotiators of collective agreements during the pandemic in 5 countries, and we invited them for participation in an online survey. Of those 1,300, 180 of them responded and fully completed the survey, which we asked them to fill out. If you are here and you're one of them, thank you so much. That has helped us a great deal in understanding the dynamics of the COVID pandemic on your negotiation processes. 180 means a response rate of about 13%, but mind you, this response rate differs a bit between countries. Most respondents which we were able to reach were from the Netherlands, about half of them, and also Austria and Italy had quite a bit of responses. And also those 3 countries will be the 3 countries which I will focus on for the sake of this presentation. The other 2 countries in there, France and Spain, were a bit underrepresented, as you can see, and doesn't give us very much meaningful responses to analyze separately. Good to understand is that about half of the respondents, and that's also something that I'm really glad about, they present a fair balance between the 2 sides of the negotiation table. About half of the respondents that we were able to interview were from trade unions or other employee representatives, and about the other half were from the side of employers or employers associations. Also good to put in perspective is that the majority of respondents surveyed was involved in negotiations at the sector level, and only the minority were involved in negotiations happening at other levels, company level or more wide national level negotiations. This is the scope of the data, if you will. So first, we started asking a few questions about the overarching influence of the COVID pandemic on the negotiation process. And to really one of the first questions which you asked was, did the pandemic made it more or less difficult to reach an agreement? Well, we were interested in the negotiation process. And here, what you can see is that, and I will talk you through the country by country effects a bit, is that for the Netherlands, over 50% of the negotiators found that the pandemic significantly hampered reaching a collective agreement, with only 7% saying that it made it easier. Although a fair share, close to 40%, experienced really not so much change in negotiation difficulty. That's for the Netherlands. For Italy, we see a broadly similar pattern. Around half, 52% of the negotiators found the negotiations harder during the pandemic, but also here about half of them really found no change in negotiation ease or difficulty during the pandemic. Unlike the Netherlands, that is, no Italian respondents saw any ease of negotiations during the pandemic times. Austria, here, I think the overarching pattern is stability or continuity. A substantial majority here reported that there's really no change in negotiation difficulties during the pandemic, with only 31% of the negotiations finding it harder to negotiate. Well, if anything emerges from this first picture is that if anything, and perhaps unsurprisingly, COVID did not make things easier. Did it make things harder? Maybe. For some, in some respects, it did. But we also see a lot of respondents, which, especially in Austria, saw a more stable pattern in ease of negotiations. A second question, which we asked was, so multiple factors factor in a negotiation process. It's never about one thing, obviously. So how important then was the COVID pandemic compared to other factors that may have affected the negotiations? And here we see that, and this is a rather consistent pattern across all countries that we analyze here, is that COVID is regarded as quite important here. Perhaps not always the most important factor, say the darkest green bar here, But if we take together the two greenish bars, we see that the majority of respondents did find COVID important, if not very important. And it's only a minority in all countries which say that COVID is not so much important in the negotiation process. In Italy, maybe the share of respondents attributing no significant importance is somewhat bigger. But all in all, I think that the pattern is fairly consistent across countries that COVID did matter. Now, this survey was on the renewal process, the negotiation process. And I think that something that we also looked at was, so did the mode and the frequency of negotiations got affected by COVID? Also, and this is something I can say less about in this presentation, we got a lot of open answers to these types of questions as well. And a lot of them were about online negotiations, making things more difficult. Sometimes also comments about negotiations being stalled for a moment, postponed, especially during the first phases of the pandemic. But thereafter, we asked people whether or not the frequency of negotiation talks was affected by the COVID pandemic. And here we see that in Italy and the Netherlands, just in terms of frequency of negotiation, it's mostly monthly frequencies. And in Austria, negotiations tend to happen a bit more incidental, occasional negotiations. But if you look at the bottom half of this figure, we see that regardless of the upper half, the differences in change of negotiation frequency, the frequency did not so much change during the pandemic. If we ask people whether or not they came together more or less often, most respondents would answer that this stayed about the same throughout the pandemic, or at least comparing the negotiation frequency before and after. Close to 80% of the Dutch respondents report this form of stability. Over 50, close to 60% of Italian respondents say this stayed about the same, and also about 80% of the Austrian respondents claim that negotiation frequency did not so much change during the pandemic. That said, frequency may not have changed that much, but like many of us, things moved from offline to online during the pandemic, and that is also true for the negotiations that were happening in these three countries under study. Also here, it's good to mention that yes, things moved to online negotiations as well, but not spectacularly, maybe even. I think if you look at the shares of respondents which still report fully offline, so face-to-face meetings, or mostly offline face-to-face meetings, this is quite still substantial throughout the pandemic. In Austria, if you add these two up, about 50% of them claim to have negotiated mostly offline. The same holds for the Netherlands, maybe not so much in Italy, where the online mode is more prevalent. But also the flip side thereof, a fully online form of negotiation is not the dominant format of negotiations in the negotiations for which we interviewed these negotiators. Only 8-9% of the Dutch respondents claim to have negotiated fully online. 5% of the Austrian negotiators claim to have been negotiating fully online. Again, country differences are there. We see again the Italian respondents to have reported more online negotiations. So yes, things moved online, not in full, and not to the same extent across countries. We asked respondents another question about how the COVID pandemic may have affected the negotiations as such. We asked them whether or not the pandemic or quarantine measures sometimes hindered the availability of negotiators. So did the composition of the negotiation teams and delegates change because people had to quarantine, for example? In Austria, again, this did not so much happen. 42% says it didn't happen at all. Another 37% says, well, it may have happened seldomly. And only 20% in the Austrian case says, yeah, this happens sometimes. But in the Austrian case, none of the respondents report this happened often. And also in the other two countries, it happened to be a bit more. They were a bit more disturbed maybe by these types of quarantine or measures or other COVID effects, but not to a very alarming extent, I would say. So again, there are these impacts of the pandemic on these, say, negotiation environments or circumstances, but they're not very well, sweeping in that sense. This was a survey about the negotiation processes. We've discussed, well, let's say the backgrounds of those negotiations. I have some information on where these negotiations were about, but they are not very surprising in that sense, because they also signal something that I think we also know from before pre-pandemic times, that mostly these negotiations are about wages. We asked respondents what were the most important topics during the negotiations, and nearly all, and they were allowed to check 3 topics out of a preset list. Almost all negotiators report that the main topic, the main concern were wages. Close to 100% of the Dutch negotiators, 80% of the Austrian ones, and 65% of the Italian negotiators. The second most critical topic reported was work-life balances, at least for Austria and the Netherlands. Job security is the second most important topic in Italy. And perhaps interestingly, despite the, say, pandemic prominence of remote working was only the key topic of negotiations for around 20% of the Dutch respondents, and even less so of Italian and Austrian respondents, which may also signal that there was much agreement about this facilitation of remote working and working from home among negotiators. Then wages were most important, and if we asked negotiators some perceptions about wages, for example, then most negotiators would report that the outcome of the negotiation would have been that wages increased. 90% of the Dutch negotiators report an increase in wages, 70% of the Italian negotiators, and also close to 90% of the Austrian negotiators report an increase in wages. Now, again, mind you, and may also be something that we'll be talking about later this afternoon, it is difficult to disentangle this increase in wages from a COVID effect that we were interested in here, from a, say, rising inflation effect, which we may have seen after the pandemic or in the final stages of the pandemic. But at least we see wages to have been increasing. We also asked respondents whether or not things change in terms of first coverage. So the number of companies or number of employees covered by collective agreements. And here the recurring pattern is mostly stability. 60% of the Dutch and Italian respondents claim that coverage of the agreement for which they were negotiating did not really change. In Austria, this number is even higher, over 80%. And if anything, the number of coverage rates that is assumed to have increased is slightly bigger than the number of negotiators who report a decrease in coverage. But again, the overarching pattern is stability and continuity, I would say. And this also holds for the perceived number of negotiating parties. So the number of signatory parties which have signed agreements. COVID did not seem to have really changed the number of signatory parties signing an agreement. This has stayed the same for the vast majority in the perception of the negotiators. Then we asked the negotiators about the quality of the social relationships between social partners. And we started first with a question about, well, how do you perceive the quality of social relationships between trade unions and employers and perhaps other involved parties at this moment, and or at the moment of negotiations during the pandemic. And here, I think that well, despite these differences between countries, there's a clear pattern that the quality of relationships between social partners are perceived quite favorably. Good to very good by 60-50-ish% of the respondents. It's only a minority of respondents which claim that the quality of relationships between the social partners was bad during the negotiations that we were looking at. And as a follow-up question was, we asked them, so, and then did the quality of relationships got better or worse during the pandemic? And here again, I think that the recurring word is things stayed about the same. It's 60-70% of the respondents across all these three countries which report the quality of relationships before or after the pandemic is similar. And if anything, the group which even reports improved relationships between social partners is slightly bigger than the group that reports worse relationships between social partners. But the recurring pattern here is that well, the relationships did not change so much. We asked two questions about changing perceptions about power of social partners during negotiations. On the one hand, perceptions about whether or not the power of trade unions changed. As you can see in this slide, we phrased the statement as such that, do you agree or not that the power of trade unions has weakened during the pandemic? And I think that in all three countries that we see here, the recurring perception is that no, this is not the case. More respondents agree with or disagree with this statement than agree with this statement, especially if you add on top of that the respondents who say, well, they neither disagree or agree with this statement. In any case, the perception is not that the power of trade unions has weakened, and something similar holds for the power of employers. Also here, we asked, do you think or do you perceive that the power of employers or employers associations have weakened during the pandemic? And also here, only very few respondents agree with that statement. The group that disagrees with the statement is much bigger than the group who agrees. And even if you, again, on top of that, include the group which neither agrees nor disagrees, it balances out the, or it overpowers the group that agrees with a weakening perspective in this sense. There was the power question. Then I had a summary slide summarizing the main conclusions. And I think that this recapitulates what I've been saying before. Yes, COVID had a noted significant influence on the negotiation process. It had mixed feelings whether or not it made it more difficult or not. We see still a substantial group who agrees, but also who disagree with this statement. There was a shift, but not a full shift to online negotiations. However, it did not seem to affect the frequency of negotiations that much, which remained rather stable. We also see stability in terms of changes in coverage rates or involved signatory parties, increase in wages. I guess we will talk about wages more. And all in all, as said, good relationships between social partners. during the pandemic. Unchanged good relationships for the most part, and also relatively unchanged balance of power between negotiating parties. That was about it. If time permits, Fiona, I can take questions in the chat, and if not, we can leave it to a discussion section at a later stage.
Yeah, we can. I mean, if somebody has a really burning question for Giedo now, please ask it. We can take, I think, one question to Giedo if you want. Otherwise, if you feel a little bit shy, you can also ask it in the chat, and I'm sure that Giedo can pick it up like that, either via chat or in the panel session. Otherwise, I would very much like to. We have Joanna. Go ahead, please, Joanna. Ask your questions as well to Giedo.
Yes, hi. So sorry, maybe you already mentioned this in the beginning, but my question was about, do you have any information on where these negotiation partners, the unions and so on, the people that you interviewed, where are their negotiation partners from? For example, are they from mostly Asia? Are they from a specific country in Asia or in Africa, in Latin America? Could you elaborate on this?
Very quick. It was in the beginning of the presentation. It's all European negotiators from mainly 3 countries: Austria, the Netherlands, and Italy.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot. Any other questions to Giedo can be asked in the chat.